Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Turkey, or Turkey, whichever way you look at it, because we've been following the country for a long period of time and lots is happening. And if you saw the press, you'll know that President Erdogan actually travelled to the USA and had a meeting with Donald Trump. So we'll have a look at what the outcome of that meeting was. But I thought it'd be worth sharing with you the opening remarks of Donald Trump because I thought they were quite interesting.
It's a pleasure to be with President Erdogan of Turkey, and we've been friends for a long time, actually, even for 4 years when I was in exile, unfairly, as it turns out. Rigged election, he knows about rigged elections better than anybody. A guy who's highly opinionated. Usually I don't like opinionated people, but I always like this one.
Now, interestingly, Turkey is actually one of the countries that the USA has sanctioned, and sanctions still remain in place. And those sanctions revolve around the fact that Turkey started buying weaponry directly from Russia. So back in 2019, Turkey purchased some S-400 missile systems directly from Russia, and as a result of that, the sanctions were introduced by the USA, and they were actually removed from the F-35 fighter jet program. So Turkey had been part of that, being a member of NATO, and so they were benefiting from that in terms of actually making some of the equipment and the parts, and so there was revenue going into the Turkish economy. But as a result of suddenly starting to buy Russian equipment, they were ejected from the program, and also as a result of that, they were stopped from buying F-16 fighter jets.
Trump teased on Thursday approval for Turkey's purchase of U.S. F-35 fighter jets, as well as the sale of F-16s, is on the horizon.
And I think he'll be successful with buying the things he'd like to buy.
Turkey agreed to buy the F-35s in 2017. But its deployment of Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missiles triggered sanctions on Turkey in 2020. Sanctions that could be lifted.
Now, just before we go on any further today, quickly I'd like to ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button, because I live on my subscriptions, so the more subscriptions I get, the more the YouTube algorithm promotes my videos, so it really does help me. And also, if you're interested in this statue, which has been featuring in a lot of my videos, it's called Cheerful Square. It's actually going up in a competition and it finishes on the 30th of September. So if you're watching this video after the 30th of September, it's too late. Somebody's already won it. And if you'd like to win it, have a look in the link below. So before we get into the details as to what's been happening in the Turkish economy over the last month or so, I thought it was worth talking about what the outcome of the meeting between Donald Trump and President Erdogan actually was. So there was an agreement to boost bilateral trade between the two nations up to a target of $100 billion, which would be a significant increase from where they are today. And Turkish Airlines announced a major deal with Boeing to buy 75 Dreamliners, and discussions are now ongoing about another 150 MAX jets. So that would be a significant order for Boeing, which is obviously a US-based company. A civil nuclear cooperation deal was signed between the two nations, and in terms of the ban on F-35 fighter jets, Turkey has asked if that ban could be lifted. Now, Donald Trump hasn't given a definitive response on that, but there were certainly some good feelings coming out of the meeting, and President Erdogan has expressed hope of being able to rejoin the program soon. Now, they also discussed the Middle East, which I don't really get into on this program. I'm very sensitive about YouTube and the Middle East, so I don't want to go into any of that, but they've got alignment in terms of what they think the outcome should be. There's also been a lot of pressure placed on President Erdogan to stop buying energy products from Russia. If you follow the channel, you'll be aware that Turkey is a friend of Russia, despite the fact that it's a member of NATO. So it's got a foot in both camps. And recently, Donald Trump said that he wanted all NATO countries to stop buying Russian energy products. So Turkey's in a slightly awkward situation that the USA is saying you need to cut your ties with Russia, but the reason why Turkey is buying all of that energy from Russia is, firstly, it's close to Russia geographically, and secondly, it's getting very good deals, and Turkey economically is not in a strong position. So President Erdogan is trying to juggle the financial side of things with the political side, which is always tricky. So moving on to what's been going on in the Turkish economy, this chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation, which is one of the biggest issues in Turkey over the last 12 months. And as you can see, we've got a really nice trend here. It's coming down nicely. The only problem is that the scale on the right-hand side here does not start at zero. It actually starts at 32% and goes up to 58%. So back in August of 24, inflation was running at just under 52%, which is incredibly high. It has come down, and the most recent figures for August show that it's now sitting at just under 33%. But unfortunately, 33% is also very, very high. And if we have a look at what's been happening over the past few years, you can see that high levels of inflation have been a persistent problem in Turkey. In fact, the current rate of inflation is the lowest that Turkey has managed to get to at any point in the last 3 years. So the trend is moving in the right direction, but inflation is still a major issue. And if we have a look at how that compares to the rest of the G20, you can see that there is only one country in the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, that has higher inflation, and it's Argentina, which won't be a surprise to people who follow this channel because Argentina is also in a state of economic crisis. And it's actually very, very close now between the two. So Turkey could rapidly get to the top of this list because the rate of inflation is coming down at a faster level in Argentina than it is in Turkey. The next highest rate of inflation after Turkey is Russia, where it's over 8%, which is more than double the target rate. You'll know that if you follow the channel. And then the rest of the G20 is around 5% or less. And if you have a look at the bottom of the chart, you can see that we've actually got a country, China, where we've got deflation. So prices are actually going down. If we have a look at where Turkey sits in the world list for inflation, you can see that there are a number of countries that have higher rates of inflation, but all of them are in a state of economic crisis. So you wouldn't really want to benchmark yourself against countries like Venezuela, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Iran. So this really highlights just how serious the situation in Turkey is. And obviously, when you've got persistently high inflation, what that means is that everything is constantly becoming more and more expensive. And one of the biggest problems in Turkey for the poor people is what's going on with food prices. So if I have a look at this chart, it shows the movement in food prices over the last 12 months. And once again here, the scale on the right-hand side does not start at zero. It starts at 26% and goes up to 50%. And you can see that we've got a similar sort of trend to what's been happening with general prices. However, in August, prices have kicked up again. So back in November of 24, food inflation was running at around 48%. That is a really incredibly high rate of price increases. It did come down in virtually every single month through to July, when it got down to less than 30%. However, it's now kicked back up to 33%. And that's a worrying trend that food prices are now on the rise again. And if we look at what's been happening over the last 3 years, you can see that the trend is moving in the right direction. But unfortunately, the levels are still really high. And that's not great if you haven't got a lot of money. Now, in terms of what's going on with interest rates in Turkey, this chart shows the movement over the past 3 years. And you can see that in 2023, the government changed its perspective. Prior to that, it was reducing interest rates at a time of high inflation, which actually was causing inflation to go even higher. It then decided to change that policy and start increasing interest rates. So from the middle of 2023 through to the middle of 2024, we saw a number of interest rate increases, and interest rates got up above 50%. So that's incredibly high as well. They did come down at the start of 2025, went back up again briefly, and are now coming down again. And they've come down further in September, and they're now down to 40.5%, which is still off the scale when you think about how that compares to interest rates in your country. And if we have a look at how it compares to the rest of the G20, you can see that Turkey is right at the top of this list, way higher than Argentina, where interest rates are currently 29%. Russia is third at 17%, still very high. Brazil 15%, and then everybody else is in single figures. And the majority of the developed world are sitting somewhere around 3 or 4% at the moment. And if we look at the rest of the world, Turkey has the second highest interest rate in the world. The only country that has higher rate is Venezuela, where it's 59%. So that really puts into perspective the serious problems. And of course, when you've got very high interest rates, the problem that causes is that nobody wants to borrow any money. Companies will not borrow at an interest rate of 40% plus because you'll be paying so much in interest that it actually counters the benefit of taking on that debt. When you take on debt as a company, you need to do a return on investment calculation. So you calculate how long it will take to get your money back and how long it will take to start making profit from the money that you've used in your company. If you're paying 40% interest on that borrowing, it will be virtually impossible to get a return on that. You'll be paying more to the bank than you'll be improving the value of your company. So none of that is good news in terms of the growth of the economy. Now, if we have a look at what's been happening with the Turkish Lira, because this is also a consistent problem in Turkey. This chart shows the movement over the past 12 months. You can see that 12 months ago, $1 was trading for around about 34 Turkish lira. Today, it's trading for more than 41. So that's a significant deterioration in value over the past 12 months. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 5 years, you can see the problem here because we've got a line here that's almost at 45 degrees. It's continuing to reduce in value significantly every single month and every single day, basically. So what that means is that the purchasing power of your Turkish lira is constantly going down. Anything that you're importing will be costing more, so therefore it pushes up inflation. So this becomes a very difficult situation to break out of because as the value of your lira goes down, inflation goes up, people have got less money, they don't want to use lira, so there's a lot of people who are preferring to use US dollars or euros or any other currency that they can get their hands on. Because if you're just sitting with your money in the bank in Turkish lira, it's going down in value in terms of its purchasing power every single day. And that's obviously not great. Now, if we have a look at what's going on with the balance of trade in Turkey, you can see from the last 12 months, we've got a very difficult situation to fix here because the scale on the right-hand side of this chart starts at 0 at the top and goes down to minus 13 billion at the bottom. This is in US dollars. And you can see that in every single one of the last 12 months, Turkey has recorded a negative balance of trade. It's spending more on imports than it's receiving for its exports. So it's a net importer. And that's a problem, particularly when the value of your currency is constantly declining. So if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 3 years, you can see that Turkey has been in negative territory for the whole time. There is a slight upward trend here. So you can see that the line, when you look from left to right, is broadly going up. So it means that the size of the deficit is coming down a little, but it's a long way from getting into positive territory. So that's going to be a problem for Turkey in terms of rebuilding its economy. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's been going on in Turkey for a long period of time. And what we've seen in today's video is that the recent meeting between President Erdogan and President Trump from the USA looked to be relatively positive. The direct outcome of that is that the two countries have agreed to do more bilateral trade, and Turkey have placed some orders for jets, and they're hoping to be reinstated into the F-35 fighter jet program, which would actually bring more business into Turkey because Turkey was producing parts of the planes and it was actually getting some revenue from that. But the problem with Turkey is that they decided to start buying some equipment and missiles from Russia, which obviously upset the rest of NATO and particularly the USA, who then imposed sanctions against them, stopped them from buying F-16 jets that they'd already ordered, and also ejected them from the F-35 fighter program. So relations between Turkey and the USA haven't been great since that time, but it now looks like they're getting back onto an even keel, a stronger footing. So that's a positive from Turkey's point of view because that means hopefully they can get more trade, more business, start earning some more money from the USA. But what we've seen in terms of today's data is that there are still some serious problems in the Turkish economy that are going to be very difficult to fix. Inflation is coming down, so it's moving in the right direction, but it is still incredibly high. It's over 30% year on year. Prices are rising 33%. So, what that means is that in order to maintain your standard of living and your purchasing power, you need your wages to also be going up by at least 33% because you're going to have to pay some tax on your wages. So you'll probably need it to go up by 40 or 50 or maybe even more than that. Now, companies in Turkey can't afford to pay that because they're not making enough profit. So what that means is that the standard of living and the standard of living is going down whilst the cost of living is going up. So that means for poor people, life is getting harder. And we saw that from the food inflation data, that it's now starting to rise again. And it's some of the highest levels in the world. So these problems are difficult to fix, particularly because the value of the Turkish lira continues to deteriorate. So that means that people have less purchasing power. Anything that's being imported is more expensive. And this is at a time when Turkey has a huge negative balance of trade. It's a net importer. So it's constantly buying in things like fuel and food, and they're costing more in relative terms. Now, that's one of the reasons why Turkey has a long-standing relationship with Russia, because it's able to buy things from Russia at lower prices than it can from other countries and get better terms on the deals. But being a member of NATO and trying to get a closer relationship with the USA doesn't really go along with being a friend of Russia. So President Trump was putting pressure onto President Erdogan to make a decision, to decide if NATO and the West is where Turkey wants to align itself, or does it want to align itself with Russia? And I think fundamentally, Turkey has more trade with the rest of the world, and it's more important to the Turkish economy than the relationship with Russia. Now, President Erdogan obviously wants a foot in both camps. He wants to continue trading with Russia whilst being a member of NATO and the West. But I think we are seeing battle lines being drawn economically at the moment. President Trump is telling all the countries of NATO to stop buying Russian oil, and he wants everybody aligned on the same page. And I think Turkey is going to have to get with that program if it wants to have trade with the USA and rejoin the fighter jet program and all of those things. It's going to have to pull back from its relationship with Russia. Now, that will be a problem in terms of increasing the cost of the purchase of fuel, but realistically, that is a smaller issue compared with what's going on in the Turkish economy and the need to rebuild the industry and the revenue. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please pass a comment and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supported me, particularly everyone on Patreon. If you've been following the channel, you know I recently posted about the fact that YouTube took down one of my videos, hit me with a warning. So I wasn't very happy about that. I asked people if they could support me on Patreon, and the response has been overwhelming. It's been fantastic. So if you're one of those people who's signed up as a new patron, thank you so much for that. Really, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.